Hi everyone, thank you very much for attending my talk. I am Ceren Budak from University of Michigan, and today I will be talking to you about problematic behavior online and how to regulate it. I'm going to talk about computational approaches for measuring how such regulations happen and how such regulations can happen. In doing so, I'm going to rely on a socioeconomic theory of regulation introduced by Lessig in his 1999 book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. According to this theory, called the pathetic dot theory, there are four modalities of regulation: laws, markets, norms, and architectures. Norms constrain through the stigma that the community imposes. Laws constrain through the punishment that they threaten. Markets constrain through the price that they exact. And architectures constrain through the physical burdens that they impose. These modalities sometimes act cumulatively, and sometimes they act in divergence, and they apply to behaviors online and offline. I'm going to use this theory to guide you through some discussion on how to regulate two types of problematic online behavior, and these are disinformation and toxicity. So let's get started with disinformation. Disinformation is a significant challenge. It is not a new challenge, but the 2016 US presidential elections brought significant attention to it. While the early diagnosis after the election was quite alarming, suggesting that this form of news production played a decidedly important role in the outcome of the election, the following scholarship refutes this particular suggestion. So the question is, does this mean that we don't need to worry about? And I would like to caution you and say that is not the case, because our political opinions and participation really reaches beyond voting every 4 or 2 years. Indeed, while research suggests that elections generally can be predicted without knowing anything about the news coverage for the candidates, we don't believe that news organizations do not play a role. Even if, for instance, the media content does not change people's vote choices, it changes their beliefs about which topics are salient and which issues people base their voting decisions on, the phenomenon called agenda setting and priming. And this is one particular area where the trend of misinformation, disinformation poses an important challenge. To give further motivation here, I will rely on some findings we share in a recently published co-authored book called Words That Matter: How the News and Social Media Shaped the 2016 Presidential Election. In this book, we characterize what information is produced, how that information gets to voters, and what information voters actually absorb in this new and complex information environment that we live in. I won't go into the details of this book here. I hope that you read and enjoy it. Here, I'm just going to mention one set of results through a showing of 4 layered cake graphs that describe the topics that we observe across various data streams. So first data stream is journalist tweets. The second one is the content of the articles published by papers of record. Third is what the general audience, the public, is tweeting when mentioning the 2 nominees. And fourth was Gallup daily survey responses to the question, what have you read, seen, or heard about Trump and Clinton, asked separately in random order. Here we're only looking at Clinton, but we have a set of results for Trump as well. So there is a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. I'm only going to mention one high-level finding that we see here just by looking at the colors and contrasting the top 2, which correspond to the news media, traditional news media, and comparing that to bottom 2, which is the audience. You can see that they don't overlap that well. So the news media don't seem immensely successful in setting the agenda. Indeed, we see, for instance, that things like the email scandal and Clinton dishonesty topics are a lot more prevalent for the bottom 2, while things like domestic policies disappear. So This leads to the question, what explains this mismatch? And the secondary question, are the fake news producers better able to either set or reflect the priorities of general audience? In a 2019 study, I answered that second question and look at the alignment between what information individuals retained and what these different producers were producing. To do so, I'm using daily sample of tweets, the content of the articles mentioned in these tweets, and Gallup daily survey responses. By using the traditional and fake news content and using logos with Dirichlet priors as my methodology, I can assign a measure of fakeness to each word, and I can connect it back to the interview responses to identify that alignment. So here in this plot, we're going to be looking at that. On the x-axis, we have the most frequent keywords that were uttered in the surveys corresponding to Trump and Clinton separately. And on the y-axis, we have the weighted fakeness of these words that I described just now. The higher you are in this x-axis, the more aligned the responses or those words were with fake news coverage. Looking at Trump, we see encouraging findings in that most words are more aligned with traditional news, and there seems to be no fragmentation in that Democrats and Republicans are remembering similar things. When it comes to Clinton, however, we see a worrying pattern. There's, first of all, a significant fragmentation, difference between Democrats and Republicans, and especially Republicans are remembering things that are more aligned with fake news, as you can see with the highly positive values. Moving beyond the most frequent words in modeling all responses as a function of the respondent demographics, we can see that in addition to party, gender was is predictive of this alignment, in that male respondents were more aligned. Furthermore, we see that alignment increased over time for Clinton and it decreased for Trump. So how does such an alignment happen? One way this could happen is with people consuming fake news. And this is likely one part of it. But if you look at recent scholarship that I mentioned, you wouldn't suggest that it would be the only part of it. Indeed, this can also be because fake news producers perhaps focus on more memorable topics that people already were paying attention to. But also, perhaps more worryingly, it can be because even though ideas are initially produced by fake news producers, they can be echoed by traditional news media. And Beckler et al. Has a really convincing book on this topic, or political elite, for instance, at the time, the nominee, currently the president of the United States, echoing statements that were made by fake news producers. Regardless, either directly or indirectly, what we're seeing is that fake news producers are posing a significant challenge for democracies, and news media needs to find ways to sort of stay relevant. Which brings me back to my original question about how to regulate and limit such behavior. In answering this question, I'm coming back to this socioeconomic theory of regulation that I introduced, where the four regulators are just as relevant. When we say regulation, perhaps the first thing that comes to your mind is lawmakers introducing bills. And there have indeed been some attempts here. But regulation can also come through, for instance, community norms that ban local news content. The Elizabeth Warren subreddit has an example for us here, an explicit ban on bad sources. When it comes to markets, platforms, advertisers, ad firms, and consumers can make it less profitable to produce false information. We again have an example of this from recent past with a number of advertisers threatening to boycott Facebook if they don't take more serious action against disinformation. And finally, architectures, and in the case of the online space, the code of the platforms we work with is the architecture. So how can architectures combat misinformation? Well, platforms can change their code to make it easier to detect false information or make it harder to disseminate it. We again have an example from recent past with, for instance, Twitter having flags to flag questionable content, and sometimes even content spread by the President of the United States. So in this talk, I will focus on one of these regulators, the market, and I will focus on one of these actors, ad firms, and discuss what they can do in this space. In doing so, I will draw from findings from a recent paper led by one of the bright PhD students I'm working with. So to do so, I need to first establish a high-level understanding of the display ad ecosystem, since this is mainly how fake news producers make money. So let me start with an example. Here we're looking at the website of zerohedge.com, which is labeled as a fake news producer by a number of lists. It has various display ads here. We can focus on one of them from the Motley Fool, rare double down by alert. If you hover over it, you will see that it points to a URL from the domain googleadservices.com. So what's happening here can be described in this simplified characterization of the display ad ecosystem. We have publishers. Zero Hedge is a publisher. We have ad firms, Google Ad Services, an ad firm that sits between the publishers and the retailers, in this case, the Motley Fool. So what's happening here is that Motley Fool gets exposure. Maybe some people click the link and buy something there. This is what they're getting out of this. Zero Hedge makes money every time they show this ad, and Google Ad Services is getting a cut. The thing is, this is a lucrative business. Many of you have probably already heard about the Macedonian kids that set up fake news sites to make tens of thousands of dollars a month. Drawing on such examples, many policy and legal scholars have been calling on ad firms to blacklist fake news sites to hurt their bottom line. So the theoretical scholarship is already there, but the empirical scholarship currently is lacking, in that we don't know how much these producers rely on ad support. We don't know how concentrated that ad support is on a small number of credible ad firms that we can reasonably convince to blacklist such sites. And third, the ability to convince these large ad firms to let go of the revenue streams, and that would be a function of just how big that revenue is. So in this upcoming book with paper, we do exactly this. To do so, we make use of a range of different data, first using lists published by reputable fact-checking and organizations and scholars. We identify a list of fake, other low quality, and traditional news sites. Then, using other lists that are used in privacy and security research, we identify tens of thousands of ad servers, and also we check whether they show any malware or viruses to determine their own credibility. Then, once we have these two lists, we identify the relationship between them using, by emulating browser behavior using Selenium API. So for a 12-week period, we visit these sites using this API, load the page, record the ads and ad servers. And this amounts to 1.8 million ads served by 900 servers in a 12-week period. Now, turning to the results, to our first question, we see that all news producers are heavily reliant on display ad support. So 85% of news producers in aggregate are showing ads. And this number is actually in line with a study we did 4 years ago, where we were looking at the broader ad ecosystem and seeing that news producers were the most heavily reliant content providers on display ads. If you ask whether traditional, fake, or low-quality news producers are more heavily ad reliant, you see a surprising finding in that traditional news are most reliant. This at first is counterintuitive, because our expectation is that fake news producers are aggressively revenue seeking and therefore should be more reliant. But when you consider the fact that showing ads is not only a function of the desire, but also the ability to show ads, as we have also seen in our 2016 paper, then we can better understand that, for instance, long tail content providers with small traffic might not benefit too much from having these ads. And indeed, when we control for the size, the traffic, and the age of a domain, we see that fake and clickbait sites are showing a lot more ads and partnering with a lot more ad firms. Next question is how concentrated this support is. And this is important to answer because if these fake news producers are relying on a long tail of ad firms, some of which might not care about their own reputation, this would not be a great policy to go after. Luckily, we do see that this is highly concentrated. 66% of fake ad traffic, for instance, is supported by only top 10 ad servers. Compare that to traditional, where it's 38%, for instance. And what's more, even though these top ad servers are very important to fake news sites are not important to these ad servers. In that, for instance, consider Google, which makes up for 55% of fake news ad traffic according to our analysis. They make only 0.000013% of their yearly revenue from these partnerships. So in sum, we see that perhaps this could be an effective approach for combating disinformation. However, there are a number of challenges to keep in mind. First, we need a better counterfactual analysis to account for substitutions. Second, it is rather difficult to define these fake news producers, have an agreement on that, and identify them at scale. And finally, even though we show that markets can regulate disinformation, we can't and don't say that they ought to, given various concerns, including concern about whether we want these platforms to be regulating speech. Let me for now sidestep that last point that I think requires a broader debate within academia and our societies, and focus on the second one. And I believe that second one is anyways a prereq to be able to answer the third one. So the question is, can we have an agreement on which sites are fake news producers, and can we identify them at scale? Let's start with the first one, the agreement. Here I will draw on results from a paper from we wrote last year, where we did a meta-analysis of research of misinformation and disinformation and identified 5 lists that were commonly used in the literature. We looked at their agreement and how much they affect downstream analysis. So, and the results are a mixed bag. Bad news is that there is little agreement. 50% of domains are listed by only one list, and only 6% of domains are listed by all. What's more, if you are looking at prevalence or exposure, and a number of studies are doing that, the results are highly dependent on the list that you choose. So for instance, if you're looking at fake news prevalence leading up to the 2016 election on Twitter relating to the nominees, that value would range between 3% to 42%. Which is a really wide range. But the good news is that there is agreement on the nature of fake news producers, which is reflected in the consistency that we see when we're looking at temporal analysis, as well as analysis of agenda setting differences and similarities. To answer that agenda setting similarities and differences question, we use semi-supervised approaches to identify topics, and then we validate them using crowdsourcing, and we investigated to what degree certain topics are more or less important to fake versus traditional news. So here we're seeing that, for instance, topics like email, Middle East, sexual scandals, the ones in the black box, are more important to fake news, and horse race coverage, economy, and climate more important to traditional news, no matter what list you choose. So this is encouraging. Right? The agreement on the nature of fake news is suggesting that perhaps we can build automated approaches to identify them at scale. which brings me to my second challenge and another paper from last year. And here, given the importance of this problem, scholarship indeed heard the call and is responding. There are a number of papers mentioning fake news classifier in the last few years. And what we did in this paper was we did another meta-analysis of the literature, identified 23 papers that were proposing classifiers, reached out to them, heard back from 5, and got 5 classifiers, and that were varied in the machine learning paradigm and the data source that were used, and did a kind of a systematic analysis. What we see is there are a number of concerns here. First is that the model performance is rather inconsistent across different data sets, metrics, and out-of-sample testing techniques. So which classifier outperforms the other really is quite context dependent and hard to generalize. Second, we also investigated the biases of the proposed classifiers and saw a number of challenges. For instance, we see a higher false positive rate for conservative domains across all classifiers. So outstanding issues like that would really need to be addressed before using any classifier in production mode, given the tensions and the concerns about a liberal bias generally worded in our highly polarized society. In general, I do hope that our field moves closer to a systematic evaluation of these proposed approaches, agreeing on data sets and metrics of evaluation. And I really want to thank the authors who were willing to share their code with us in helping us move closer in that direction. So with that, I want to move on to the second problematic behavior that I promised to talk about, which is toxicity. So toxicity is also another important challenge for the health of our online communities and communication. While online platforms have this promise of enabling democratic discussion and debate, the reality of them really mostly includes incivility, harassment, and hate speech. How do we fix this problem is the question. And again, we can come back to these regulators and think about all 4. I won't have time to go through all 4 examples, so I will just directly go into the one that I care about talking about in this talk, which is norms. So how do norms regulate toxicity in online political communities? And here I will mention findings from another recent paper led by another bright PhD student I'm working with. So norms in offline communities have indeed been central to enforcing civility. The online nature of these spaces that we are studying and the high user churn that comes with them introduces new challenges, right? So the question is, despite this people coming and going, can online communities achieve a stability, consistency in these norms? And if so, how? The first question, can or not, we can show here a plot that says that they indeed can do this. So here we're looking at the toxicity levels across different political subreddits that we have studied in our paper, and we're seeing that their toxicity levels are quite stable and distinct. Right? So we have white rights that is above 40% toxic versus Ask Economics only, let's say 3% toxic. And our analysis also shows that their user bases are changing rapidly with a large fraction of newcomers each month. So the question is, how do they do this? So scholarship has identified different norm-conforming processes that might be at play here. There are 4 of them, 2 of them pre-entry, 2 of them post-entry. Pre-entry ones are, first one, selection. People tend to join communities that are more like them, in this case, more like them in their expectations of toxicity. And second is pre-entry learning. People who have decided to join a community can observe that community and change their behavior before they make their first contribution. Post-entry processes include selective retention, which means that people who are more like the community might stick around for longer than those that are not. And finally, post-entry learning says that once you join a community and you are participating, in addition to observing, you can also get feedback from others and adjust your behavior accordingly. So as you can see from the citations here, the past work has looked at each one of them mostly in isolation. The goal we have here is to identify their relative strength for allowing political subreddits to keep their norms stable. There are 4 steps. Very quickly, we first identify political communities using supervised learning techniques. Then we measure toxicity norms for communities by looking at the fractional comments that are toxic according to Perspective API's toxicity classifier and not removed by moderators. Then we identify communities that were stable and distinct, and then we quantify these norm-conforming processes using mixed effects binomial regression modeling to look at the mean toxicity exhibited by users. Okay, so here are the results. We're looking at 4 plots here corresponding to 4 norm-conforming processes, and for each one, there is a data point per subreddit. So here we're looking at self-selection. Each data point corresponds to 1 subreddit. The x-axis is the distinctive toxicity of the subreddit, and the y-axis denotes the corresponding effect for that subreddit. So for instance here, neutral politics is 18% less toxic than average as given by the x-axis, and yet it attracts people that are only 3% less toxic than average, right? So there is some selection effect, but it's a small effect. If you look at pre-entry learning, you see that this effect is much larger, as you see from the slope of the line here. For instance, for neutral politics, people adjust their behavior to reduce toxicity 13%. So 13 of the 18 coming from pre-entry learning. And we see that selective retention and post-entry learning in general is quite low and generally insignificant across all communities. So what is the high-level finding? The high-level finding is that most norm-conforming happens pre-entry, and most of that is due to learning pre-entry. So what we're seeing is that Redditors are surprisingly good at absorbing norms and conforming them rapidly. So what does this study suggest? One, surprising to me at least, that the norm processes work rather consistently across various political spaces. We also have policy recommendations based on our findings. For instance, given that people are learning mostly pre-entry, you might want to make the values of your community more visible, maybe having the moderator actions being visible. And finally, given that people adjust the environment, it might make sense to judge people based on their interactions in the given space, as opposed to using their interactions from outside. Taken together, I hope that I provided some intuition for how modalities of regulation currently work and how they can work. And now I just want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. One of them is that I didn't talk too much about unintended consequences, but they are really important to keep in mind. For instance, in a recent study where we were looking at architecture, the one other modality of regulation, and looking at the architecture of threading, we have seen that if you don't think through your design that carefully, it might have unintended consequences, secondary effects. So these are important to keep in mind. And finally, it's also important to consider that even though I talked about them in isolation, these modalities are not independent. They interact with each other. Sometimes they support, sometimes they block each other. And therefore, it's important to study their interactions as well. Overall, these are hard problems, and solutions will take a while to get right. And so I think perhaps the call is that we need to keep doing these observational studies to understand how they're working and how they could work, and perhaps doing small-scale experiments before applying any of the modalities to regulate at scale. So with that, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.